All right, ready to dive deep into some serious JFK assassination research.
Always ready.
You've provided a stack of articles and excerpts here from Volume 5, Issue 2 of Kennedy Assassination Chronicles. It's like a highlight reel of research on JFK.
This magazine, it's for the real hardcore researchers. They've got everything in here. Articles, conference info, book reviews, the works.
Yeah, and it's amazing, right? Like and see the conversations happening within the research community.
Definitely. And I think that's what we'll try to do today, like going through all this material, seeing what the big points are, the questions that are still out there, things like that.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, this issue starts on kind of a somber note. The editors offer their condolences on the death of John F. Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and Lauren Bessette, that plane crash back on July 16th, 1999.
Yeah, it's a reminder of just how much tragedy this family has endured.
Yeah.
Even decades after JFK's assassination, it's like it just keeps following them.
It's really eerie when you think about how the crash happened. I mean, the NTSB report said his plane just suddenly dropped like 700 feet right off the radar and then just gone.
Chilling.
Yeah. So moving on, there's an article here that digs into the controversy surrounding the windshield of JFK's limo.
Ah, that's a big one.
Right. And this article, it talks about the claims that that the windshield was replaced to cover up evidence of a shot from the front.
I remember reading about that. There was even a story from a Ford Motor Company employee, right?
Yeah.
The guy who claimed he saw the windshield being destroyed and that it had a bullet hole right through it.
And then there's a letter to the editor, and it argues that even if there was a shot through the windshield, it might not have even hit JFK.
Oh, interesting. What are they suggesting?
Well, the author says it could have missed him entirely, or even hit Governor Connolly. And they point to researcher Penn Jones Jr.'s book, Forgive My Grief a Few, as support for this theory.
I see. So you've got all these different perspectives, these competing narratives trying to explain the same event.
And that's what makes this case so compelling, Every detail seems to have layers upon layers of argument and counter-argument. Like, take Dr. Evelia Glanges. She claimed she saw a hole in the windshield at Parkland Hospital.
That's significant, especially since she was a medical professional.
Exactly. Not exactly someone prone to making stuff up.
Makes her testimony a lot more credible, right? And didn't she speak to researchers Vincent Palomara and Doug Weldon right before she died in 1999?
She did. It seems like she really wanted to make sure her story was heard.
It must have been really important to her. Okay, so where does that leave us with the windshield? Still a mystery.
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely shows how every piece of evidence in this case can be interpreted in so many different ways.
So much ambiguity. Okay, what else is in this issue?
Well, there's an article about the Zapruder film. It dives into specific frames to try to determine when that first shot might have hit JFK and how it relates to the single bullet theory.
I feel like we should probably clarify what the single bullet theory is for listeners who might not be familiar.
Good point. So the single bullet theory is this idea that one bullet caused all the non-fatal wounds to both JFK and Governor Connolly. It was a key part of the Warren Commission's conclusion, but a lot of researchers disagree with it.
Right, and that's where the Zapruder film gets really interesting, right? Because experts have been analyzing this footage for decades, trying to find clues that might support or refute the single bullet theory.
Yeah, and the article highlights some experts who've really dug into the film, guys like Doug DeSalles and Bill Hamley. The stuff they pick up on is amazing. Like, they can pinpoint the exact frame where JFK's hand freezes mid-wave, or the frame where his head jerks to the left, or how Jackie's eyes are completely fixed on him.
It must be incredible to see those details and try to piece together what was happening in those crucial moments. And what about the HSCA? Didn't they come to a different conclusion about the timing of the first shot?
They did. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, they actually concluded that the photos support a shot hitting JFK before the limo goes behind that Stemmons freeway sign.
Right. Which means, if that's true, then the Warren Commission's timeline is completely off.
And it gets even more interesting when you start looking at other eyewitness accounts. Some witnesses describe the limo's position and people's reactions in ways that seem to support this earlier timeline.
It's like a giant puzzle. Every little detail, every piece of evidence could hold a clue.
All right, get ready for this one. There's an article here profiling William Godet.
William Godet, remind me who that is.
He was a journalist and a staunch anti-communist. But here's the thing, he had alleged ties to the CIA.
Oh, wow, that's right. Talk about a life ripped from a spy novel. He was also a correspondent and recruited by Nelson Rockefeller, wasn't he?
and possibly involved in the CIA's Domestic Collections Division. Plus, he published something called the Latin American Report, which he claimed had both the CIA and the KGB as subscribers.
Wait, the CIA and the KGB? That's wild.
Right! Like, what game was he playing?
And then you have his connections to those other figures in New Orleans. Clay Shaw, Guy Bannister, David Ferry. Those names always come up in JFK research.
It's like he's at the center of this massive web, but we don't know if he was the spider or the fly.
What a tangled web indeed.
Oh, and here's the really crazy part. FBI reports mention Godet in connection to Jack Ruby buying paintings from some guy named E. Lorenz Borenstein.
Hold on, Jack Ruby, as in the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald.
The one and only. But Godet, he completely denies having anything to do with those paintings. He thinks someone was trying to frame him, to use him as a distraction.
That's a classic intelligence tactic, isn't it? Misdirection. Make someone else look guilty to take the heat off the real culprit. It's right out of the spy playbook.
And then you have to wonder why the FBI would even try to drag Godet into this, especially considering his strong anti-communist views. It doesn't seem to make sense.
Unless, of course, they were trying to paint a picture of a much wider conspiracy. You know, like they needed someone to connect the dots between Oswald and Ruby and all these other figures. And Godet, with his alleged CIA ties and his connections to these shady characters in New Orleans, well, he fit the bill perfectly.
Especially during the Cold War, you know? The idea of a communist plot to kill the president, that would have terrified the public. Godet could have easily become the perfect scapegoat in that scenario.
A patsy, so to speak. And speaking of conspiracies, what's this about there being 2 presidential limousines?
Oh, yeah, this is where things get even weirder.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
So the second limo, they called it Chic the Second, and it was totally top secret. Ford, the White House, no one ever admitted it existed.
A secret presidential limo. That's fascinating. Why all the secrecy? Was it just a backup, or could it have been something more sinister?
Well, the article speculates about a few possibilities. You know, maybe it was used for spare parts for the main limo, or maybe it was a backup in case the main one broke down.
Or maybe, something for covert operations.
Right. But the crazy thing is, FOIA requests to the Secret Service asking for travel logs or modifications for either limo, they've come up empty.
Wow. Talk about a lack of transparency. And in a case like this, it really makes you suspicious, right? Like, what are they trying to hide? And what about that smoking gun memo? Didn't it show that the Secret Service ordered new carpeting for the main limo just days after the assassination?
They did. And that's a huge red flag, right? Why replace the carpeting in a car that's basically a crime scene? Makes you think they might have been trying to cover something up. Bullet holes, bloodstains, who knows?
It's one of those details that just screams cover up. Why the urgency to replace the carpeting so soon after the assassination?
It's really strange, especially when you consider that there's another memo showing the Secret Service had already asked for money to replace the worn-out carpeting months before the assassination. So if they were planning to replace it anyway, why the sudden rush to order new carpeting right after the shooting?
Something's fishy, for sure. It just doesn't add up. Almost as if they were trying to follow a script, even if the details didn't quite make sense. This whole limousine situation, it's like a mini mystery all on its own.
It is. Speaking of mysteries, let's switch gears a bit and talk about Dealey Plaza itself. One of the articles actually argues that the plaza, the actual crime scene, might have been tampered with.
Hold on. Dealey Plaza as evidence. That's a new one. What makes them think it was messed with?
The author points to inconsistencies between the Zapruder film and photos taken during those reenactments done by the Secret Service and the FBI. They specifically focus on the Stemmons freeway sign. You know, the one that partially blocks the limo in the Zapruder film.
Right, that sign. It plays a big role in the single bullet theory, right? Because it's all about the timing of the shots and whether they happened when the limo was hidden behind the sign.
Exactly. And according to this article, the sign's position in these different photos just doesn't match up. For example, in the Secret Service reenactment, which was done just hours after the assassination, the sign is placed in a spot that would actually allow for 3 separate shots with each one hitting its mark.
See, that right there blows a hole in the single bullet theory, because that theory needs 2 of the shots to have happened while the limo is obscured by the sign. If the Secret Service got the sign placement right, then that theory falls apart.
Right. Then the article compares those photos to ones taken during the FBI reenactment, which happened months later. In those photos, the sign is in a slightly different spot, one that's more consistent with the Zapruder film.
So the sign just magically moved between those 2 reenactments? I don't think so.
And that's exactly what the author is suggesting, you know? that somebody deliberately changed its position to fit the story they were trying to tell.
To fit the Zapruder film, right? Which brings up a pretty unsettling possibility, doesn't it?
It does. The author thinks the most likely explanation is that the Zapruder film itself might have been altered sometime between December 1963 and May 1964, which is the period between those two reenactments.
Wow, now that's a bombshell. If that's true, then the most famous piece of evidence in this entire case could be a fake.
It really makes you wonder, right, like if they were willing to go to those lengths to manipulate the evidence, what else might they have covered up?
Exactly. It goes way beyond just moving a sign on a set. We're talking about potentially altering the historical record itself.
It's pretty chilling when you think about it. And you have to remember, the single bullet theory wasn't the original explanation. It only came about after the Warren Commission started their investigation. So if they did tweak the Zapruder film to fit this new theory, it implies a deliberate effort to control the narrative, right? To manipulate the evidence to support a conclusion they'd already reached.
It really makes you question the whole idea of official narratives and how much we can trust what we're told, especially in cases like this where there's so much at stake.
I mean, it's a case that's shrouded in mystery, contradictions, unanswered questions. And honestly, I think this deep dive has just shown us how much we don't know.
It's true. The more we learn, the more we realize how many more questions there are.
But that's what makes it so fascinating, right? This constant search for the truth, this piecing together of a puzzle that might never be fully solved. It's frustrating, but it's also incredibly captivating.
Absolutely. It keeps you digging, keeps you thinking, keeps you wondering. And that's a good thing, right? To keep questioning, keep searching, keep the conversation alive.
It's wild, right? Like all these little details that just don't quite add up.
And they make you wonder, what else might be out there? What other pieces of the puzzle we haven't found yet?
Speaking of puzzles, there's this other article that dives deep into the Zapruder film. The author, Barb Junkarinen, argues that the film actually contradicts the single bullet theory's timeline.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading that one. Junkarinen goes frame by frame, right? Breaking down those crucial moments.
Yeah. She points out all these things that suggest JFK was hit before the limo went behind that Stemmen sign.
Like what? Remind me some of the details.
Well, remember those reactions we talked about earlier? JFK's hand freezing, his head jerking, all that. Junkarinen says those reactions happen way too early for the single bullet theory to work. If he was already reacting to a shot before going behind the sign, that blows the whole theory out of the water.
It would change everything, wouldn't it? The timing of those shots is crucial.
Absolutely. And Junkarinen doesn't just rely on the film itself. She brings in witness statements, photo analysis. She even looks at the reactions of Jackie Kennedy and Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman. It all seems to point to this earlier timeline.
So it's not just her interpretation of the film. She's got other evidence to back it up.
Exactly. What really struck me was that she brings up the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations that investigated the assassination back in the 70s.
Right, the HSCA. They came to some pretty different conclusions than the Warren Commission, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, Junkarinen points out that the HSCA actually pinpointed frame 219 of the Zapruder film as the moment JFK was first hit. They even say there's photographic evidence of a shot striking him by then.
Wow. So even an official investigation like the HSCA was questioning the single bullet theory? That's huge.
It is. And then there are the witnesses who were actually in Dealey Plaza that day. Junkarinen highlights a few, including Charles Bronson, not the actor, and Phil Willis, who are both taking pictures. They both reacted to something that sounded like a gunshot before frame 220 of the Zapruder film.
So they heard a shot before the limo even reached the spot where the single bullet theory says the first shot happened.
Right. And these guys, they had different viewpoints in Zapruder. They could actually see the limo even when it was partly blocked by the sign. So their accounts add even more weight to the idea that something happened earlier than the official story suggests.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? You've got all these pieces of evidence from different angles, and you're trying to figure out how they all fit together. And in this case, it seems like the evidence is painting a different picture than what the Warren Commission told us.
It definitely makes you think twice about accepting official narratives at face value. We have to remember to think critically and weigh the evidence for ourselves.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly trust what we're told, especially in a case like this where there are so many conflicting accounts and unanswered questions.
Speaking of unanswered questions, let's circle back to those two presidential limousines for a minute. The fact that Chic 2 even existed and was kept such a secret, it just raises so many red flags.
And the Secret Service stonewalling any request for information about either limo that just adds to the suspicion, right? Like, what are they so afraid of revealing?
Right. It's like they're deliberately trying to keep something hidden. And then there's that whole carpeting mystery. Why rush order new carpeting for a car that's potentially evidence in a murder investigation? It just doesn't make sense.
It's incredibly suspicious. And remember that memo we talked about earlier? The one that shows the Secret Service had already asked for money to replace the old carpeting months before the assassination. If it was already worn out and they planned to replace it anyway, why the sudden urgency to order new carpeting right after the shooting?
It's just one of those details that makes you go, hold on, something's not right here. It really lends weight to the theory that evidence might have been tampered with to fit a specific narrative.
It's like in those crime shows where the detectives find a seemingly insignificant clue that ends up blowing the whole case wide open. Those little details can be crucial.
Exactly. They can be the key to unlocking a whole new understanding of what really happened. And it's the same with the JFK assassination. We have to pay attention to those seemingly minor inconsistencies because they could be the key to uncovering the truth.
They might seem insignificant on their own, but when you start putting all those little pieces together, a whole new picture can emerge. It's like connecting the dots in a giant conspiracy web.
All right, let's dive back into Dealey Plaza for a bit. We were talking about that article that suggests the plaza itself was tampered with as evidence.
Oh yeah, that one was fascinating. The whole idea that the crime scene itself might have been altered. That's a whole other level of conspiracy.
It is. The author, Michael Parks, focuses on those photos of the Stemmons freeway sign, the one that partially blocks the limo in the Zapruder film.
Right, and he found inconsistencies in its position, didn't he? Like it wasn't always in the same spot.
Exactly. In the Secret Service reenactment, which was done right after the assassination, the sign's positioned in a way that's consistent with 3 separate shots, all hitting their intended targets.
Which, again, completely contradicts the single bullet theory. If that reenactment accurately reflects the actual scene, then the single bullet theory just falls apart.
And then Parks compared those photos to the ones from the FBI reenactment, which took place months later. In those photos, the sign's in a slightly different spot tone that's more in line with the Zapruder film.
So, someone moved the sign. That's pretty bold, isn't it? Tampering with the actual crime scene.
That's what Parks is arguing. He thinks someone intentionally moved it to fit the evolving narrative, to make the scene match up with the story they were trying to tell.
It's a bold move, for sure. But if someone was determined to control the narrative, I guess they'd be willing to go to any lengths, even tampering with the crime scene itself.
And his conclusion is even more startling. He says the most likely explanation is that the Zapruder film itself was altered.
Wait, seriously? The Zapruder film? That's like the holy grail of JFK assassination evidence.
I know. It's considered to be the most authentic visual record of the assassination. If it was tampered with, that casts doubt on everything we think we know.
It would change the whole game. What makes Parks think the film was altered?
He points out that it was probably changed sometime between December 1963 and May in 1964, which is the period between those 2 reenactments we were just talking about. And if you remember, the single bullet theory wasn't the initial explanation. It only came about after the Warren Commission started their work. So if they did alter the Zapruder film to fit this new theory, it suggests a deliberate attempt to control the narrative, right? To manipulate the evidence to support a conclusion they'd already reached.
That's incredibly disturbing.
Yeah.
If they were willing to tamper with such crucial evidence, it really makes you wonder what else they might have covered up.
It's a question that has haunted researchers for decades. And honestly, I think this deep dive has just shown us how much we don't know.
It's true. The more we learn, the more we realize how many more questions there are.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it so fascinating, right? This constant search for the truth, this piecing together of a puzzle that might never be fully solved. It's frustrating, but it's also incredibly captivating.
Absolutely. It keeps you digging, keeps you thinking, keeps you wondering. And that's a good thing, right? To keep questioning, keep searching, keep the conversation alive. Welcome back. I don't know about you, but after all that, my head is still spinning from all this information we've uncovered about the JFK assassination.
It's a lot, that's for sure. But I think that's part of what makes this whole case so gripping, right? You know, it's complex, full of twists and turns. And even after decades of research investigations, we're still left with so many unanswered questions.
It feels like the more we learn about this case, the more we realize we don't know.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's like a giant puzzle, but with missing pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And even when you find a piece that seems to fit, it just creates even more questions.
It's true. Before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on a few more things that really stood out to me in this issue of Kennedy Assassination Chronicles. Like, there's a section called Passages, and it has obituaries for people connected to the assassination.
Oh yeah, passages. A reminder that this wasn't just some abstract historical event, right?
Yeah.
Real people's lives were deeply affected by this tragedy.
Exactly. And there's this one obituary that really got to me, It's for Nicholas Akershuk Jr., a high school history teacher. He was actually known as Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Kennedy. Wow, what a nickname. What's the story there?
Well, he taught at John F. Kennedy Memorial High School in Paterson, New Jersey. And he was incredibly passionate about teaching his students about, the JFK assassination.
That's awesome. Imagine having a teacher who was so dedicated to exploring the truth about, such a controversial topic.
He didn't just teach about it in class, though. He actually took his students to Dallas to do their own investigations.
No way. That's amazing.
He wanted them to see Dealey Plaza firsthand, examine the evidence, draw their own conclusions. He even created a whole curriculum focused on the different conspiracy theories surrounding Kennedy's death.
Wow. That's what I call hands-on learning. He was basically encouraging them to think critically, question what they were told, and not just blindly accept the official narrative.
Exactly. He was a true inspiration.
He sounds like an amazing teacher. What a legacy to leave behind.
Definitely. It's just one example of how the impact of the JFK assassination continues to this day, It still inspires research, debate, activism. It's a case that refuses to be forgotten.
And for good reason. It's a pivotal moment in American history, a turning point that continues to shape how we view our government, the media, the very nature of truth itself.
There's one thing I've always wondered about, the transport coffin that was used to carry President Kennedy's body back from Dallas to Washington.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Whatever happened to it? You'd think it'd be in a museum or something, right?
You'd think so, but according to one of the articles here, it was actually dumped into the ocean.
Wait, seriously? They dumped it in the ocean?
Yeah, back in 1966. Apparently, it was at the request of the Kennedy family.
That's unexpected. Do we know why?
Well, like most things in this case, the whole thing was shrouded in secrecy. But there are documents in the National Archives that detail how they loaded it onto a C-130 airplane and dropped it into 9,000 feet of water off the coast of Maryland.
A secret ocean burial for a coffin. That just adds another layer of mystery to this whole saga, doesn't it?
It does, and there's even a memo that describes a conversation between Robert Kennedy and the head of the General Services Administration.
What were they talking about?
Well, they were discussing what to do with the coffin, and Robert Kennedy was apparently very insistent that it be destroyed.
Destroyed? Why so adamant about that?
The memo actually quotes him saying, "I think it belongs to the family, and we can get rid of it in any way we want to."
It makes you wonder what their motivation was, right? Was it just about privacy? Like they didn't want a piece of such a tragic event to become some kind of public spectacle? Or was there something more to it? Something about the coffin itself that they wanted to keep hidden?
It's a question we may never have the answer to. But I think that's what keeps drawing us back to the JFK assassination, these little mysteries within the larger mystery, this constant search for answers, this attempt to piece together a puzzle that might never be fully solved.
It's a case that compels us to think critically.
Yeah.
To question everything and never give up on the pursuit of truth. And even if we never get all the answers, I think the process of seeking them out is incredibly valuable in itself.
I agree. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the JFK assassination, what are your final takeaways? What stands out to you the most?
For me, it's just the sheer volume of information out there, the countless threads of evidence, and the dedication of the researchers who've devoted their lives to unraveling this mystery. It really speaks to the lasting impact of this event.
I agree. And we have to remember that the search for truth is an ongoing process. There are still documents being declassified, new technologies emerging that could help us analyze evidence in new ways. It's a case that's always evolving.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that history is never truly settled. There are always new discoveries to be made, new perspectives to consider, new questions to ask.
And who knows, maybe one of our listeners out there will uncover the next crucial piece of the puzzle. As we've seen in this deep dive, even the smallest details can have a huge impact on how we understand this pivotal moment in history.
So, to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for the truth. The answers are out there somewhere, just waiting to be found.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the JFK assassination. Until next time, keep diving deep and never stop searching for the truth.